Hey, everybody, you're listening and watching to CareMinds podcast episode. I'm your host, Daniel, and today we're talking to Nick McKenzie, Group Product Manager of Redox. It's a pleasure having you here, Nick. Thank you very much for finding time.
Yep, thanks for having me, Daniel.
We're going to touch base on lots of subjects. I think you guys in here for a treat. Starting with, just talking about Nick, making sure that everybody kind of gets an understanding that this person is a person of sheer focus and will. And I think Nick pursued leadership opportunities very much early on, even since high school and his college years. So, Nick, can you walk us through how did you kind of manifested these qualities?
Yeah, I think for the majority of my life, I think I've really enjoyed using and being a part of a team to solve difficult problems, and was an athlete in older days, and so I just have always felt that desire to have a layer of camaraderie with folks and work together towards a mutual goal. And I think I sort of, as I grew and was exposed to more and more, I'll call them activities and objects, I think I always just sort of navigated from things like, I really enjoyed working on editing the high school newspaper, and then that translated into a desire to want to understand how different groups function with each other. And so I stepped into more of a treasury and supporting the student body on the side whenever I was in college. And from there it was like, I'm actually really interested in how organizations are funded and managed. And so I think there's just been this natural evolution of taking positions of interest as my size of activity involvement has expanded over time. And so I've naturally tried to work in a way that allows me to facilitate some of my outgoing personalities and take on more of a leadership role. So over time, I think I just naturally gravitate towards solving hard problems with large folks and smart people, and still try to do that today.
Awesome. And you also, I think you are the type of person that applies the received knowledge right away into the practical domain, right?
Yeah, I would say we just had a round of annual reviews, and I would say one of the things that consistently gets construed for me is I have what's people refer to as a natural bias for action. So I particularly move forward fairly decisively, sometimes absent information. I generally kind of operate under the idea that it's better to release something from a product and have to tweak it than it is to over design and never get feedback on a thing. So I generally bias towards action and implement feedback and shared decision making and things along those lines on a fairly fast time frame, I would say, compared to other folks.
Got it. Awesome stuff. And during your early years, I think you've also tried yourself as a legal intern and decided to pivot. I was wondering, with your Wallgreens experience, a large company right away, right? How did that experience translate it into your current years of product management? And I think it taught you quite a lot of things. So can you please share that with us?
Sure. Yeah, I think I had an initial hypothesis whenever I started to work at work for Wallgreens. I think I as you mentioned, I was a legal intern. I thought a career in law was the route for me. I thought more schooling might be something I would want to do after undergrad. And while I had a great internship and really learned a lot about what criminal defense looks like, it was sort of an idea that I actually would rather work in maybe some other domains outside of the legal system. And so, in other words, my internship it helped me focus on things that maybe I thought I wanted to do, but actually refactored me into a different way. And so my hypothesis for working for Wallgreens was I knew at some stage I wanted to work in healthcare and I wanted to work in technology. And Wallgreens is pretty approachable because it's one of the largest, most recognizable brands in the United States. And it was an ability to see fairly up close and firsthand how the interplay between commercial side of healthcare delivery and the personnel side of healthcare delivery takes place. And so, an amazing kind of entry level career opportunity, was able to get my state certification as a pharmacy technician, understand how prescriptions come in, how they get paid for, how customers interact with them, see the interaction between pharmacists as frontline healthcare providers interact with their patients and support them. So it was really kind of like the initial first taste of what now has become a 10-year, 15-year career in healthcare IT. But, it's a fairly high bar to approach something like an inpatient hospital or something along those lines. And so starting with Wallgreens, starting with something that's more consumer oriented was a lot more approachable right out of the gate for me.
Yeah, Nick, awesome stuff. And I think Wallgreens also taught you a lot of things when it comes to client-facing interactions, and you've seen lots of things, right?
Yeah, I think so. From an undergraduate perspective, I had a sort of a dual degree approach. I majored in economics and then also in political science. And my hypothesis was that the economics side gave you the legal and logic framework to be successful as a lawyer, and then that the political science side would get you exposure to the presentation and the relationship building and all the other aspects that go into success in the legal field. But it actually turns out that those two areas of study actually fed a different relationship that I hadn't foreseen whenever I signed up for them. The economic side and the logic constructs and thinking about how to unpack macroeconomic conditions in a fairly serialized way is actually really decent background training for understanding how computer interactions function. So there's a series of outcomes and decisions. And so if you can follow the logic tree, you can actually pick up architectures of systems pretty quickly. And then the other side, political science, I didn't know it at the time, but it's actually a great training experience for what having a role in consulting and in front of clients looks like. I spent a lot of time at various hours of the day, overnight, so on and so forth, directly interacting with customers on the floor in Wallgreens. And that requires you to think on your feet, to be able to execute and understand what the business objectives are, understand the customer's problem, and then work through to a resolution fairly quickly. These are all really necessary traits in any consulting engagement. They're just kind of done playing out in a different scale and in different theaters. So high level, I think my Wallgreens experience was interesting because it was, as I mentioned, kind of the first foray into understanding and applying how some of the business evolution happens in healthcare, and then to be able to engage with and support customers right on the front lines was actually a really good preparatory task for standing in front of healthcare systems at my later job at Cerner.
Awesome stuff. Very, very diverse background, as well as a very interesting one. I think one could only hope of getting such a thing early on. And I think that your next career move at Cerner was a very interesting experience and a very so one could say unconventional approach to gaining product management experience. I think our audience would definitely love to hear this.
Yeah. So the quick primer on my background at Cerner, I decided that I wanted to having been exposed to what I learned at Wallgreens, and turns out I was fascinated with how the receiving and integration systems worked at Wallgreens, where scripts came from, how they got integrated with doctors, where the insurance payments came from. And so I was like, okay, my next move is definitely to work somewhere more directly on the healthcare IT, the IT side of healthcare. And so it was a natural transition to look for something, one of the major electronic health record vendors, Cerner, Epic, Athena, so on and so forth. So I'm from the Midwest. Cerner's, was just a short 3-hour drive away from where I was from, hometown. And I applied and took on a pharmacy consulting role, and in true meaningful use era fashion and height of the delivery of digitization of the U.S. healthcare market. I showed up on my third day, and we had a business need, and on Monday the following week I was in a different state, not working on pharmacy at all, and I kind of bounced around most of my first year, and what was a typical development track is for a single application like pharmacy or something. You learn your app, and then you become the solution architect of that app, and you gain more knowledge, and then you become kind of the subject matter expert of that given application. And that was kind of my intended path. And really my path didn't follow that trajectory at all. I just got exposed to 16 or 17 of Cerner's applications in my first year. And, by the time I rounded out and got a bunch of on-site clinical experience supporting folks at the elbow, Cerner kind of came back and was like, this guy, he's been exposed to too many things. We can't send him back to just one solution area, one consulting track line. So let's give him a chance at integration architecture and see if he can, help help customers and clients like sequence and think about putting together an entire system in the right set of steps. So I've always joked that my second move at Cerner was integration architecture, which was like essentially the chief architect of a given EHR implementation. And I always joke with folks, it's like building a house. So you have roofers and contractors and electricians and plumbers, and everybody has their individual specialty, but somebody has to put the whole plan together and make sure step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 happen together, all in the right order. And that's kind of what the IA's role was. And so I really enjoyed doing that, and projects small to very large over the course of 5 years. And inherent in that role was the responsibility to support and help assist in a given project of like connecting with non-Cerner systems. So I learned a lot about integration standards, HL7v2, how to do interfaces, how to read interfaces. And so I was always fascinated with this idea of like being the translator, helping clinicians translate their requirements into what they wanted the system to be designed like, and then translating back to the technical teams and forth on how to execute. And interestingly enough, it's, actually all that product management really is, if you distill down to it, it's translating the problem of a customer into a meaningful solution that you derive and ship. And so I think the consulting background for me gave me a comfortability in front of customers. It gave me a comfortability with some fluency with the fairly detailed integration technology and standards. And then my consulting kind of experience helped me pivot to the second role at Cerner, which was more of a partner integration role. I helped Cerner's largest strategic partners figure out how they were going to plug in with our ecosystems and different platforms. And so inherent in any third-party interaction is, I may have to write some code, you may have to write some code, and we may have to decide who goes first, second, and third in order to understand what value we're trying to take to market together. So it was really interesting to figure out how to influence, Cerner's 3 biggest platforms and their product management suites on, hey, these are the APIs we need to build in order to really achieve the business success that we're looking for with these partners and to solve healthcare clinician problems. And that was really interesting. And then my last kind of gig at Cerner was doing that and helped facilitate Cerner's Open Developer Experience API program. So lots of background working with third-party, app developers and so on and so forth, and leveraging a more modern API healthcare standard like FHIR. And so it's just been an evolutionary journey from exposure to the system, understanding of a single portion of the system, understanding the whole system, understanding how to connect multiple systems. It's just been like this wild ride that I've been on for the last 10, 12 years. And really, really amazing experience so far.
Yeah. And what I personally find fascinating is that you kind of really thrived with the approach, just going for it. One could say am I ready for, managing multiple stuff at such a large company, right? Whilst you were, open to challenges, and that proven to be the right path. And I think you were long enough at Cerner to see kind of like a mindset shift from being kind of like a closed system, right, to thinking more of an open, integratable one, right?
Yeah, I think my thinking particularly changed over the course of my career. It was a realization that despite the number of applications I had ever helped implement, or the number of systems I had helped implement those at, across 3 different platforms, it was painfully obvious to me that there were a bunch of niches in healthcare IT that Cerner or any other EHR wasn't going to be able to do everything. And so at the core of it, this is, around this same time, you start to see the advance of, cloud compute thinking and API forward interactions just in other industries. And so I think at the time I started to connect the dots and realize that while it's super advantageous to be successful and understand how to make our clinicians and customers successful, it's super important to understand that my evolution on thinking was, it was really great to know as much as I knew about a single system, but actually I was more interested in understanding how to expand that knowledge into the interaction and support of many, many systems. And so that mindset thinking was along the lines of, I learned as much as I could learn about basically a single EHR. I wanted to take some of that partner integration experience and really do that at scale across the whole EHR industry. And so that sort of definitely was if you will, the nudge or the nuance for coming to a place like Redox next. To essentially, that's their forward-facing mission.
Awesome, good stuff. And essentially, Redox is also a well-known company. This is basically like a single API for payers, providers, and products, right? How would you compare your experience and overall kind of like culture at Redox compared to you've been also exposed to working at a Fortune 500 company, right? So what
Yeah.
are the main differences and how would you like go about them? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, the interesting thing about Redox is it shares actually an overall mission that's very similar to Cerner's, which, Redox's mission making the world's healthcare data, frictionless for adoption. And I think at the core of it, at the end of the day, I might work on a lot of ones and zeros, but at the end of the day, we do it because we're trying to facilitate better care for eventually our folks. One of the monikers that we start with at Redox for every large team meeting is the mantra that we are all patients. We might not be patients today, but at some point, all of us will become patients, and all of us have family members or friends or others that are patients. And so, it's a very nice connective tissue to think about. Like, you might work on hard, complex technology problems, but at the end of the day, you're facilitating a care experience or a clinical decision outcome that may better the improvement or the delivery of care to a particular patient. And so I think I would call that the consistency between the two major companies I worked for in my career is just at the core of it. It's a desire to leverage technology to improve care outcomes for the health of people. I think differences between a Series D 250 person startup and a Fortune 500 company with 25,000 people is the mechanics of operating the business are different. Things like HR management, annual reviews, culture. These things are at a big company are handled in more of a centralized administrative type function. And at Redox, they're very personal. You have a lot deeper ability to impact folks on a direct nature. The span of like influence for folks is just much smaller at 250. And we're even kind of to the point still a little bit where you can say somebody by their first name and everybody in the conversation that you're with knows exactly who you're talking about. That is definitely not a characterization of my time at Cerner, given there was 25,000 people. So I find the culture at Redox to be much more personable. I think there's a tremendous focus led by one of our founders around, inclusiveness. And another thing that's sort of interesting is, Redox culture has been a remote first company since its inception 7 years ago. So none of this like pivoting post COVID, like Redox was born remote. They realized that they could acquire, engage, and, accelerate their customers and talent through a remote strategy. So the ability to build relationships in sort of a different fashion, which was, versus how I came up at Cerner, which was more of a like, let's go to the office. And when you're not at the office, you're on a client site somewhere. So it was very physical and in nature. And Redox builds a really effective, inclusive culture, especially through in a remote fashion, which has been an interesting sort of change from my Cerner days.
Good summary. Yeah, and so you are pursuing the challenge of knowing about the other EHRs, right? And Redox offers you this possibility to do so. And if we're talking about the measurable stuff when it comes to product development at Redox compared to, once again, like a larger Fortune 500 company, what are I think like the go-to KPIs that could be applied to both scenarios, and where are the differences from your perspective?
Yeah. I think one of the KPIs that's been fairly consistent for me is just I tend to look at adoption metrics as an indicator of like value creation and success. So, my last gig at Cerner, one of the keyest or the truest set of KPIs that we were looking at was just like, what's our API transaction volume? Are people interacting with the connective tissue and technology stack that we've built? And if they are, on what scale, and what do we see that growth look like? And I think around the time I started doing that work in 2018, we were doing, I don't know, a million Fire API transactions every 30 days at Cerner. And by the time I left in 2021, it was north of 100 million a month. And so you just see the impact and scale of what systems you power at Cerner. And I think KPI wise at Redox, we have a similar construct of like, traditionally Redox's core DNA business has been facilitating independent software vendors to successfully have a normalized interaction experience, no matter which EHR they're trying to integrate with. And I think at the core of it, adoption there is also a point. We're in the process of kind of building out this, if you will, two-sided network effect where we facilitate our traditional customer, which is an independent software vendor, to connect to all these different EHRs, Cerner, Epic, Athena, Allscripts. And on the other side of that, you have these healthcare organizations that are choosing technology to buy from independent software vendors. And so they're getting more familiar with how Redox delivers those integrations, scalably, so on and so forth, and support them through the ecosystem. And so we're building this sort of KPI adoption model where you get this kind of two-sided network effect. We call it a virtuous cycle where we get more ISVs, that connects us to more HCOs. More HCOs become exposed to Redox, who are then choosing more ISVs who become Redox customers. So you get this nice like symbiosis of two-sided network effects. So I think adoption and connection points are definitely something that we focus on from a KPI perspective. We have a cool little website. It's explore.redoxengine.com, and it has a really interesting visual of like over the 7 years of Redox's life and tenure, how the nodes have just continually expanded in a visual way, and you can just see the breadth of the network growing. At this point, I think we're at Redox, going back to the KPI for a minute, we are facilitating tens of and hundreds of millions of API transaction calls a month across our network. And so at the core of it, like you're just seeing the connective tissue of healthcare data flowing across, and vendors of all different kinds, customer types of all different kinds. So for me, adoption has always been like a theme of KPIs that I've really looked at and tried to implement in my work historically in the industry.
Got it. Would you clue us in what are the current product focus of Redox as of now? Something that you can talk about, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. To this point, I would say Redox has kind of facilitated multiple product lines in the past. I mentioned our ISV business. I think today we're in the midst of what I would call a DNA shift and change. We're expanding our buyer personas. I think fundamentally we're now engaging in ways with different entities than we had engaged in the past. We've always connected to health information exchanges or healthcare organizations, but typically those folks haven't been our customer traditionally. And now we're getting into really interesting scenarios where we are facilitating migration of data from the EHR to, a healthcare organization's cloud, as an example. We're facilitating engagements on the payer side of the equation. So there's been obviously legislation that influences and engages payers to provide more of an API access to consumers. And so we're getting involved in that model. And so I think our buyer persona and product focus is changing. And to do that, it means you have to expand the platform's, some sort of key areas to support more of an enterprise style model, because you have, users of different personas that need different things out of the platform now. So, we're moving into areas like role-based access controls. So different persona experiences if you're a healthcare organization user versus if you're an independent software vendor. We're trying to add a layer of advanced customization and configuration and tooling. One of the things we've learned either in writing our own API standard or now also facilitating the standard for Fire is that not every two entities treat the same, what we think is the same standard the same way. And so we've built these configuration layers that typically or traditionally have been more internal tools. And now we're finding a way to make those UI, UX accessible, customer facing tools so that they can control their own integrations at scale without the need for a Redoxer to intervene. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we're adding things like, a whole layer of self-service auditing, configuration, and building out a reporting ecosystem. So when you have Redox as kind of this nexus point in the middle, and it's facilitating all this data exchange, you want to be able to run reports on it, understand health checks, so on and so forth. So we're really taking that opportunity I think we've sort of proven our ability to transact the data on a myriad of different format types across a myriad of different healthcare options and entities. And I think now it's like taking that to the next level from a user experience perspective and putting more self-service tooling in hands and SaaS offerings for our customers of different types.
Awesome. And some of the challenges that you are currently working on as a group product manager at Redox?
Yeah, I think like most places in product, we have a never-ending list of wishes of features to be done and only so much time, energy, and resource capacity to do it. So like any other challenge or portfolio to manage, like it's deciding, oftentimes the most important thing is decide what not to do than it is to decide what to do. So I think development challenges there is, interesting macroeconomic client or environment right now. Lots of companies are sort of battening down the hatches and getting back to their core focus so that they can harden the business during what might be some fairly uncertain economic times. And Redox and other companies like us are in no different perspective there. So I think our particular challenges right now are we're going to go execute on some of these next level product offerings that I was discussing earlier. I think trying to make sure that we can understand in the most concise and quick way possible some of the mindset of these new personas and buyers for us from a market perspective are going to be particular challenges. So we deeply understand the relationship between independent software vendors and healthcare organizations. Can we get to the same level of depth on payer and other interactions and so on and so forth in a time frame less than the horizon of the company so far? So I think, like anybody right now, our decision is like, where are we putting our eggs and in what basket and for how long? And then can we execute on what we say we're going to deliver and continue the growth of the business in the way that, is congruent with the goals of the company?
Yeah. On that short time scale that you've mentioned, this is indeed looks very, very challenging. Nick, what are your personal kind of like advice on, or I should say rather like pieces of advice on building and growing the right product team?
Yeah. It's a great question. And, I've had the opportunity, luckily, to help manage, grow, and develop people across my time. First, it was more of an indirect way in my consulting role at Cerner, and then later in a more formal, manager-style fashion for the Open API program and in other parts of the Cerner business. And so one of the things in terms of like suggestions or advice, one of the things I always like to do is orient towards like diversity of skill set. I have a fundamental belief that it is a requirement to avoid tunnel vision and like echo chamber type activity to have folks with various different ecosystems and backgrounds and perspectives. And if you're really truly building like a dynamic team, you want folks that have some healthy level of friction about their perspective on how to solve a problem, such that you can then aggregate the best insights from those various perspectives into an actionable strategy going forward. So, I've hired clinicians in the past, like former clinicians. I've worked with actuaries, converted engineers. Like I typically look for folks with a variety of background and skill sets. I kind of fundamentally believe that product is two-sided. It's both an art and science, and I'm fundamentally convinced you can definitely train and teach somebody the science side of it, but the art side of it is where you get kind of that diverse perspectives. And I don't know that side necessarily can be taught, nor should it. But I like the opportunity to like cultivate teams that have the ability to apply their own style. We might give a rough framework of what we're trying to do or how we're going to do what we're going to do in product, but the individual flavor, the execution, I like to, populate folks with different backgrounds and then put them together and see what cream will rise to the top. That's essentially my best advice there.
Got it. And when it comes to the quality of the decision making, does the same rule apply? Like having, more.
Yeah, I think I think one of the axioms that I try to engender with the team is like, it's not possible, given how complex the healthcare landscape is, to be right every time about a product feature, about a suggestion, about a market trend. Like, you might be right. You might just be a few years earlier than everybody else is, and it might not be the right time. So the idea that it's okay to be wrong in terms of decision making is encouraged. What we do try to strive for is decisions based on data, i.e., an emphasis on the process, maybe over instead of the results. As long as we can learn from the engagement in some sort of measurable way, that we can shift course and we have talent and attention and energy that we can refocus in a different way once we better understand the problem. In a lot of ways, there's certain folks like Michael Jordan used to say, he never lost a game. He just ran out of time to win. I sort of think that product's kind of like that too. We never are fully done in product, and that's okay. We just have to figure out ways to continually learn from the decisions that we make, and then figure out the best ways to input those decisions into our process in order to create value for our customers going forward.
I like this quote. There's always a right way, and there is actually multiple ways to achieve that, right thing. And speaking about, shifting shifting focus and pivoting from the original plan, right? What are your takes on how to navigate in an ambiguous environment for anybody out there who is listening? Yeah.
Yeah, product is it's a tough field, right? Like you have to understand business dynamics. You have to work directly with engineers. You have to involve and engage with customers routinely. So you play all these different roles. And I think because of the difficulty of the types of problems that we try to solve, I think it's really, really important to try to learn to distill problems down to their simplest fashion. So I learned this methodology in the past of this concept called the 5 whys. And essentially it's like every problem, if you are willing to ask why enough times, you can actually distill down to what the root cause of a given problem is. And therefore you can most likely generate a viable solution to said problem. So, I encourage folks to just continue prodding and asking why. I think sometimes in product management, we can be guilty of what I would call in the clinical world, we can be guilty of treating the symptoms, but we're not actually figuring out what the underlying disease is. And unless we're really going to achieve the value creation, we got to drill down, we got to ask why, find down what the problem is down at its absolute most core, basic distilled level. And then from there, you can work up the ambiguity chain, as things get more complex. But truly understanding the problem at the core of it will give you the right path to be on through the forest to solve that problem. You might not know what the path looks like or how many trees are on the path towards the end of the forest, but at least you'll have a good understanding that you're moving directionally in the correct way. And that's the sort of method I like to advise.
Yeah. So go step by step, right? And try to figure things out until they are kind of too granular that you cannot break them down further, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and given your economics background, what are your, personal takes on today's the major factors that shape today's healthcare in the U.S.?
Yeah, there's a bunch. I think there's pretty obvious ones some of the macroeconomic conditions like inflation. I think we're in the process of seeing, especially coming post-pandemic, you're seeing lots of healthcare organizations that have even more narrow margins than they had before and might not have economic sustainability or viability. So you're seeing a lot of, merger and acquisition activity where health systems are consolidating into smaller or larger entities in order to survive. I think that's an interesting factor. I think the advancement of telehealth, propagated by consumers' willingness and demand and desire to engage in healthcare in other areas other than a brick and mortar type model. And obviously that was accelerated by COVID. So I think telehealth models and those being, consistently reimbursed by the large payers is going to be an interesting paradigm to see how the care models shift. And then the ability and willingness for folks to kind of, as I will, step into scenarios where they think maybe traditional healthcare hasn't been delivered. So you see the strategies from folks like CVS and Amazon and so on and so forth to kind of, you're sort of seeing these new pay-vider models where, Optum and others, that they're taking ownership of the whole outcome for the patient, not just the payment side of it, but actually the clinical care provider side of it. And then, running their outcomes in order to facilitate the best outcome they can get for the patient. So I think that's an interesting variable. And then, other deeper advancements, if you get really into legislation, I think some variables on healthcare U.S. financial strategy is, the shift to things like value-based care, moving away for fee-for-service models, incentivizing outcomes over tests and, diagnosticians are interesting models. So there's just a lot of levers to pull in terms of when we talk about the financial aspects that influence U.S. healthcare. You could go in any of those directions for as long as you really want to.
Got it. And when it comes to, I guess, the sort of incentives that you've noticed that shape the course of industry in the nearest future, in your opinion?
Yeah. I think, you've seen some of the incentives delivered through things like the 21st Century Cures Act, an expansion of the Promoting Interoperability program, formerly Meaningful Use. I think you'll continue to see announcements around, like CMS just put out announcements around what they're trying to incentivize for improving the prior authorization process, which should speed up the delivery of care and a better understanding of the actual costs of certain care elements, and opening up the transparency between that payer provider relationship, which has sometimes been tenuous in the past at best. So I think for most nudges that we're looking for in the industry today, they hopefully are optimizing on reducing care, increasing transparency of data, or providing a facilitated ability for access of outcomes. I think when you look at some of the social determinants of health data, so on and so forth, one of, if not the biggest indicator of like your ability to achieve care or outcomes, clinical care outcomes, is the zip code in which you live. And that's a far more weighted indicator of like your ability to actually become healthy and maintain health throughout your family. And so like you have all these socioeconomic indications that are playing into these things. So anything that we can do that optimizes the availability of care, the equitability of care, and the data and transparency around how that care, what it costs and how it's paid for, and who's incentivized to make those improvements. Any regulations or nudges in that direction are definitely welcome, and whether they come from consumers themselves, they come from government, they come from private industry, doesn't particularly matter to me. If they're centered around one of those three axes, I think we're doing the right things with respect to the incentives going forward.
Super insightful stuff. Thank you very much. You think that a product manager is immune, or sort of like can easily navigate through, layoffs, right? What is your take on this further?
Yeah, I think product management as a professional discipline, it attracts all kinds of people. Like, it attracts folks that used to write code. It attracts folks that dabbled in business and architecture and technology. There's more human factors oriented folks. So I like the discipline in particular because, as I alluded to earlier, there's quite an ability to like have a signature style, and there's not necessarily hard and fast rules. Now, we get exposed to methodologies and, how do we do prioritization scoring, and what does our Scrum and Agile methodology look like? Like, these are all tenets of engaging with product, but at the core of it, I think the most successful product managers have a willingness to like learn a bevy of business aptitudes, and that means understanding operations, it means understanding the financial side of the equation, it means understanding customer interactions, it means being able to be fluent with your engineering team. So as long as you're willing to, I sort of joke with folks, I tell people, like, when they ask me what product management is, I just tell them it's like being a chameleon. Chameleons can change color depending on what environment they need, whether they need to hide from predators, whether they're stalking prey, so on and so forth. I think of product management in a very similar vein. Some days I need to be blue and engage with investors and customers and so on and so forth. Some days I need to be green and be heads down and solving a problem and helping and engaging with my engineering team on a design. And some days I'll be a totally different color and doing market research and interviewing folks and doing podcasts like this. And the thing I like about product management is, like, the only real difference is how much proportional time is everybody spending in what color, and based on the needs of your business. And so, to your question about layoffs, I don't know that anybody is necessarily immune to macroeconomic conditions. I think everybody will be affected by it. But generally, I think it's a decent bet to hypothesize that product managers who can acquire and be diverse in all these different skill sets can repurpose themselves fairly quickly and find a way to produce value in other businesses that maybe are in stronger financial positions, or so on and so forth. In other words, more distinctly, I think the chameleons in product will find a way to evolve, is probably the best way to describe their immunity, at least with respect to the economic climate.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good manifestation of a phrase, invest in yourself. Yeah, this is very insightful, very good. I think Yeah, just one more take of yours. Interoperability in healthcare. Where do you think it's going in the nearest future? What is I guess the single core challenge that you have kind of like the most observed and have the most kind of structured opinion on?
Yeah. As far as interoperability goes, I think there's really good traction on a modern RESTful API standard as the connective tissue for healthcare data, and that's FHIR. And so I think it's generally accepted, assumed, and it's sort of being enshrined even in legislation that FHIR is going to become the central access and language of interoperability in healthcare kind of going forward. So I think that's probably a no-brainer. As far as interoperability goes, I'm particularly interested in two areas. The first area I think is, it's long time been fairly costly in terms of actual financial costs, and then in terms of timeline for impactful agencies like pharma and life sciences to develop new therapies. And so the ability for a modern RESTful API standard to produce large reams of data in a structured, standardized way and at a population level, and then to feed that into that development process for new therapies. I think if you start layering in really interesting technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning into these things, we can actually really dramatically speed up the delivery of new options and available treatments to the market. And so I'm excited about the future of interoperability for the prospect of okay, we spent the last 10 to 15 years digitizing the US and getting data at least in systems. The problem was they were in different systems that didn't speak the same language. Now we're in the throes of unifying everybody to the same language. And then once we've done that, I think we can kind of get to a point, or at least we can get to a state where we can universally translate from one language to another. And then from there, you can kind of take that and apply it to some of the next level things that cloud computing, nearly unlimited, compute, algorithmic decision-making, tooling for AI and ML. And truly, you can start to see massive advancements in the delivery of new clinical care therapies. I think that's sort of one of the futures of interoperability that I hope to see next. The other kind of major tenet for healthcare interoperability that I hope to see is you've seen through CMS regulations this desire for the ability for consumers to directly own their healthcare data information and manage who interacts with it and on what time scale and for what purpose. And so another vein of interoperability that I am interested in, hopeful in, is a better understanding in a regulatory environment that supports, data patient privacy, consent laws, the ability to regulate and migrate data, and really put consumers in a really educated position about how they seek out care, how they understand what that care is going to cost them from a price transparency perspective, how they enable fluent and frictionless adoption of their healthcare information for the purposes of their healthcare benefits, and the patient kind of becomes the center. Unfortunately, this concept of the personal health record has been tried for many, many years. But I think the problem was always when I showed up with my PHR, there was no way for me to easily get what was on it to the clinicians at my hand and so on and so forth. And so my hope for the next level or the next generation of interoperability is to truly enable that foundational idea of a personal health record to come to life and to actually be executable in a frictionless way such that patients can provide their health data, only the healthcare data that's necessary for their privacy, but for their care outcomes. And then they can do so in a way that is frictionless, easy, and actually contributes to better care. So in terms of where is interoperability in healthcare going, I think it's hopefully in those two big directions. And I look forward to being on the front lines of solving those types of challenges going forward.
I can only say that both of these two are really, really valuable. And to your point, when it comes to differentiating your development team with people with different skills and different perspectives, I'm wondering, what is your take on trusting somebody else's experience whilst also being exposed to a lot of business context? Do you find merging these is kind of like the superpower, or how should a product manager pursue those two qualities? Should they be worked on independently, or kind of should a product manager lean on some of them if he feels like it's the best sort of outcome for a particular situation that he's working on?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think there's probably a style aspect to this question, but from my vantage point, I sort of think about that in the mindset of it's impossible to build the whole product in a single sprint or in a single time horizon, like it's an eventual evolution of a product. And so I sort of come at it from the perspective of it's impossible to know all of the data inputs and market research and insights that you would want to have at your disposal to make certain decisions. So in a lot of ways, like when you're building or shipping a product, you're trying to get to the most relevant and minimally viable product and released out the door so that you can get meaningful feedback from the consumer, from the customer, and then you can orient from there. I sort of think about data gathering and decision making as a product manager in the same way. You need to acquire enough minimally viable information to get started in a direction and produce an initial design and so on and so forth. But you can definitely overanalyze or over-index and spend too long collecting information, analyzing it from every direction before deciding on a path. So I'm more of a fly it and try it at the same type of a guy, if you will. And so my general proclivity is it's important that I can understand the process that a product manager that I work with or works for me is undergoing, understanding how they're collecting information at the outset, how they're going to collect information during, and how they're going to collect information posthumously to a release. And as long as they can show me a clear plan to do that, I'll back whatever the decision that the data says. If that's what the data says and we can measure that data and shift our plans accordingly, great. But I think where product managers can struggle is not having enough minimal viable data or collecting too much data, and then there's noise in the signal and you can't really decide what you need to be doing. And so I tend to err to, just like in creating a product, collect enough information to have conviction on a direction to start, but then be committed to the delivery and commitment and analysis of information as you're in flight, and then change accordingly.
Yeah, more data is not necessarily the right thing sometimes.
Sure.
Nick, it was amazing. Thank you very much for your participation in this. I think lots of insights have been covered. I've had a blast. Things that you want to, I guess, notify people about, maybe Redox is hiring for those who might be super interested in joining your team. Please go ahead, tell folks what to expect at Redox.
Yeah. I mean, at the core of it, we have a lot of really exciting opportunities for the growth path for Redox. As I mentioned, we're emerging across a bunch of different business lines. We're particularly excited about our relationships with our large cloud hosting provider folks. And so we're sort of becoming the ingress and egress point for data from healthcare institutions into the cloud so that all those exciting next level technologies like AI and ML that these cloud operators have built can be leveraged on that data. So building this normalized API experience for the facility and delivery of the future of care is kind of really exciting. And Redox is kind of in that emerging growth stage, Series D. The company's going to decide what it's going to be here probably in the next 12 to 18 months. Is it going to be a publicly traded company? Is it going to work in a more of a merged partnership type way? Like, what's the outcome going to be? So it's a particularly exciting time to be at Redox. And as I alluded to earlier, we have a great grounding in the real intention for why we do what we do, which is at the core of it, we're all patients. And so finding a way to make healthcare data useful in a variety of mechanisms is just for me, it was the definitely attractive feature to come towards Redox. And for like-minded folks that are interesting and, look for hard problems to solve with smart people, Redox is a great place to do that.
Awesome. Good stuff. Nick is also open to networkship, so please visit his LinkedIn page. Thank you very much for joining this episode. You've been listening and watching to CareMinds podcast episode. I was your host, Daniel. This was Nick McKenzie, Group Product Manager at Redox. See you soon, guys. Take care.